Hi everyone, Magnus here, and the plan for today's lesson is to cover the closed Sicilian with bishop to b5 from the white perspective. Now what I'm going to do in this lesson is be covering black's most common responses, all the way from the most common at the start to some of the less common at the end, so that if you only want to watch a bit of the video, you can still get a pretty good idea from like the first half or so about what you're going to be facing the majority of the time. But at the same time, if you want to like fully patch up your repertoire and make sure that you will never be surprised by any of the black responses, then do make sure to watch the whole thing. And yeah, so try to follow along. You can take some notes if you want. But without any more of preamble, let's get straight into the analysis. So in the closed Sicilian, this is my openings tree, which is basically all of the openings that I've ever played on chess.com, at least on my main account by the name of Douglas. So I used to play pawn to f4, which is known as the Grand Prix attack. I'm sure a lot of you might be familiar with that. Unfortunately, I found that in this line, I'd struggled to get a good position after this line with g6, knight to f3, bishop g7. I have tried bishop c4, but I'll show you why not a huge fan of that one either. But bishop to b5, knight d4, castles, a6, bishop d3, e6. I never really liked the positions with pawn to d5. I just didn't really think I was getting that much from them. So this pawn, they hold on to it like this. I used to play b3, bishop to b2, but they just end up guarding this pawn and playing f6 after castling. And simply the positions that I got were just not very good. Like, yeah, I mean, knight b4 is not a good move actually. Knight b4. Okay, so I got a better position in this one. But I was going to say f6 is always quite troubling in these lines. For example, if you see captures, there's already a capture here. You can't recapture because of pressure on the queen. So I didn't like this line very much. And equally, I didn't like bishop c4 either, because I always thought that there's just e6, and after the standard move d3, knight e7, and you can try and play for f5, but I never really got anywhere with, say, I think you can just castle, probably, but f5 might be a bit too soon as well. So white castles, you get d5, and really you always find that white's just getting pushed back. You can see scores very well in the Masters database. So for all of these reasons, I started playing bishop to b4 immediately because I still liked the core of the closed Sicilian. I actually think that the Grand Prix has some very good positional elements that are quite underestimated by a lot of people. They don't really consider that it's actually quite a strong positional opening. And the move bishop to b4 allows f4 to very often be played later on in this sort of Grand Prix setup, but you don't actually go for the kingside attacks, which is very interesting. You actually end up with quite often some kind of bind in the center, taking space, and then playing on the queen side, which you'll see later. So what inspired me to start playing bishop to b5 rather than f4 is that there was one line in particular in the Grand Prix attack that I really liked, and that line is after g6, knight f3, bishop g7, bishop to b5, if black doesn't move the knight here. And let's say black plays e6. I really enjoyed positions where you get to take on c6, play d3, and castle. And after castles, I always felt like white just had a super pleasant position with something like b3, maybe not in this exact move order, but you eventually play like e5, b3, and let's say like black fails to do anything, you get pawn to c4. And this was always my dream, playing the Grand Prix setup. You get this lock in the center. Black has these double pawns. And then you have very, very simple play against this c5 pawn with the bishop coming to a3. The queen comes to f2, and the knight on a4 is already attacking. And simply put, there's not a whole lot that black can even do to fight here. If black ever goes for f6, the bishop can choose to go to b2, and after a capture, you can recapture with the pawn, bishop, or the knight, doesn't really matter. Probably something like here, queen takes, I guess knight takes, g3, and this setup is just so good for white. Black will never have any play. So, I really liked getting this out of the Grand Prix setup. But like I just showed you, this can be avoided quite easily with black, with these other setups which are a lot more aggressive, with the knight to d4 move. So for this reason, I stopped playing f4 immediately and started playing bishop to b5. Okay, so now we're going to dive straight into the bishop to b5 theory, which is really the meat of what I want to talk about today. So let's move to a chess.com analysis board. The point here is the close Sicilian, knight c6 is most common and is the best move. Because after f4, like I said, knight c6 allows all these knight to d4 moves. But equally, there are sidelines, which we will cover. a6 for one. d6 is another, not very good. e6. And knight f6 is just a bad move. e5. White gets an advantage. So no one's going to play knight f6. And the reason why knight f6 is bad against knight c3 rather than knight f3 is that after e5 there's no forward knight jumps. This is very important. Then I would simply have to go back. White can play d4, comfortable advantage, something like queen f4, bishop b5, and knight to f3. Okay, so I'm going to cover these in order of the most common played moves against myself, because I think that probably gives the best gauge for what you guys are going to run into most. So we're going to look at knight to d4 first. Okay, well, firstly, we're going to look at this position. Knight c6 is by far most common, then e6, then d6, and then g6. And then we'll also look at a6. So I'll keep note of this branch. But first, we're going to look at knight to c6. I'll probably timestamp this in the edited version of the video. So knight to c6, bishop to b5 enters the line that I was discussing. And then we're going to look at knight d4, g6, e6, and d6. d6 is just a bad move though. So we're going to cover all of those ones. Firstly, knight to d4. So after knight c3, knight c6, bishop b5, knight d4. The move that we are going to be playing is knight to f3. When going against a low-rated player, I really think that this is very effective against high-rated players as well, because I've been playing this all the way up to 2300 and really haven't had any problems with the closed Sicilian setups. Like I don't know if I've beaten GMs, but I know I've beaten a couple of IMs with it. So it definitely works and is much less studied by title players as well. Okay. Also, if you guys watch Gotham Chess, I do believe he likes bishop to b5 sometimes in his own games as well. But anyway, the move here that we like to play, yes, the close Sicilian is very good. The move here we like to play is knight to f3. And the reasoning is this. The most common response is knight takes on b5. We simply want to develop the knight, challenge their knight in the center that's already spent 2 moves, and also we want to get castled as quickly as possible and bring a rook to the e-file. Now, you might say that black has just put their knight in the center to attack our bishop. But in fact, taking the bishop is actually not a very good move, even though it's by far one of the most common. So if knight takes bishop, we will obviously recapture, and as I've already highlighted here, there's a number of moves that black can go for. A very common move is actually pawn to d5, but this is a mistake, and I want you guys to try and, well, it's not a big mistake, it's an inaccuracy. And I want to see if any of you guys can come up with the reason why d5 isn't good. Now, d5 looks like a great move. And the reason is because when there's not a knight on c3, in the Sicilian, you're always taught that if you can break with the move pawn to d5, then black will simply equalize. But that is just not the case. b5 line. Yes, exactly. The move pawn to d5 drops a pawn because you cannot recapture the pawn. And of course, the reason you cannot recapture the pawn is because of this check tactic. Now, this is a very common motif in this opening. You definitely want to keep an eye out for this one when the knight ends up on b5. It's not the end of the world, though. Black can go a6, and after knight c3, knight f6, this is another line which now attacks our pawn in the center. I liked the move d4 here. This is what I used to play. Castles is objectively best, but I am going to show you guys what I played, which is pawn to d4, knight takes. Then I think I used to take on c5, and after knight c3, queen d8, king d8, bc. No one really knows the best line with black, and while these are tripled Irish pawns on the c-file, with moves like rook to b1, bishop e3, and bishop d4, the knight can also quickly jump in, pawn goes to c6. This is actually extremely venomous with the white pieces. And if black players don't know the best move f6, you can run into huge trouble. So, for example, if you just try to play a natural developing move like e6, knight to e5, and white is already considerably better. The black king has to go back, bishop to e3 guards the pawn. Let's say bishop to e7, rook goes to the b file, and black is clearly worse. Let's say f6 kicks the knight, knight c4, and the knight has many nasty squares that it can head to. You can play king e2, f3, bring a rook, and simply put, white is up a significant amount of development. And these pawns here, these triple pawns are not in fact a liability, but a strength, because black never gets a chance to develop. So I can show you guys some of my own games that reach this position. BC, and a couple people do know f6, but as you can see, the win rate's not too bad. Anyway, on f6, I was playing bishop e3, castling, rook goes to the b file, and by the looks of it, I was playing a4, a5. Now, this isn't the best approach, but my pawn is under attack, so it makes sense. So I planted my rook on b6, I brought my other rook, I remaneuvered my knight into this game. So the knight does love to access c4. It wants to go to the a4 square, a5 square, so they played a5. But this now gave me knight to a3 and knight to b5. and after which, oh, I hung a mate. That's pretty bad. Okay, but if I took back with this rook, then white would have had a dominant position. So yeah, I hung back rank mate. It's probably a blitz game, or a bullet game, I guess. But yeah, white would have been much better here. Pressure on this pawn, pressure on this pawn, the c4, the c6. Just make some luft, and you can have a great game playing down the b file. Okay. So clearly this setup is not very good for black. Pawn to d4 is a good one to remember. It's not very normal, but you don't generally want to play this when you've played f4, but it's very different. This system is extremely flexible. With knight to c3, you can easily transpose into some weird open Sicilians with knight to f3 as well, if it's beneficial. All right. So I think that's pretty much pawn to d5 analyzed. And we're going to look at pawn to a6, which is by far the most common move. Yeah. So a6, we of course go knight back to c3. It doesn't want to go to a3, that's just a bad square. d4, of course, hangs the knight, and there's nowhere else to go deeper into enemy territory. Now, white actually has an extremely comfortable position here. Your plan is to play d4 and take back with the queen, seeing that there is now no knight on c6 that can kick your queen, and from d4 your queen will always spy the g7 pawn, make it very hard to either fianchetto or develop this bishop here, and as such black will have a hard time castling the king. Because they don't want to go queenside, the queenside is already weak, especially with the c pawn here. High positional. Okay. So, I think e6 is probably the most common move that I faced. Actually, d6 is the most common move, along with b5, then e6, and then g6. So we'll take a look at all of these. First of all, d6, the most common move. We go d4, takes, queen takes, and pawn to e5 is, I think, another common response. So d6 takes, takes, queen takes, and knight to f6 is the most common, but after e5 you just drop your queen back to d3, and you may notice that they have this pawn weakness now on the d6 square. So e5, queen d3. Queen b4 is objectively the best square, but I always find it quite dangerous, so queen d3 is what I go for, and also the most common move in the Masters database. Now let's say they just develop. You can put your knight in the center, knight f6. You could consider taking either of these pieces. Say that you take the bishop, queen takes, you develop your bishop, they castle, you castle, bishop to e6 makes sense. They want to try and play d5. You can remove the piece that wants to play d5, captures. The pawn here is now weak. Queen b4 is counterintuitive. Yes, I don't know why it's the top engine move. Do I play the Magnus Sicilian? No, we're not looking at that today, because that requires you to play the open Sicilian, and you have a lot less control over the amount of lines that black can play. I think you can only play the Magnus Sicilian against the Najdorf as well. And here I really like the move pawn to c4. And the idea is that you go b3, you bring your rook to the center, the knight can go to e3 and then to d5. You can also play a4 to shut down any b5 ideas. And eventually you'll just get a good knight versus bad bishop and a backward structure for the black pieces. White is clearly better. So that's what you want to go for if they play pawn to e5. Alternatively, d6 is hanging, but it's quite risky to take it. So I'll just go back to that line. You were pointing out d6 is hanging, and this is the best move. The only thing is that after something like here, let's say queen takes e5, queen e5, knight takes, there's rook d2. and all these pawns will be quite loose. And if you don't take, and you just say like queen b6, I guess there's already queen f4 counterplay. This knight can come under pressure, the rook goes to d2. I mean, objectively, you might just be able to keep grabbing pawns. Say bishop goes to g4. If you grab another pawn, though, all of a sudden, you can come under huge fire. Obviously, this isn't possible with the queen here, but I wouldn't want king safety like this. I guess f5, rook f6 is an idea, and this looks quite dangerous. So often, this d-pawn is pretty dangerous to take until you've consolidated your queenside and kingside positions. And even if you can get a free pawn, sometimes it isn't worth the play that black can get. So you might be better off just playing b3 c4 or c4 b3. So I think that probably answers that question. So we're still in this line. We've discussed d6 and we've discussed e5, but knight f6 is also extremely common. Now the move that we like to play against knight f6 is actually bishop to g5. And we're not necessarily going to take immediately, but the whole point of bishop g5 is that we're pressuring the knight, which is a key controller of the d5 square, which we might want to access with our knight, and then we can use that to infiltrate the black position later on. So let's say that black plays e6. We have long castles, good pressure on this pawn here, and if bishop to e7, there's pawn to e5. Captures, queen captures. Now the queen is under fire from the rook. They don't have any good squares with the queen. If the queen goes to b6, there's even probably knight to e4. If knight takes, bishop takes, king takes, queen takes, you're in huge trouble here. The king hasn't castled, loads of development, and a bad light squared bishop. So you have to play bishop to d7. You want to set up an attack on this g-pawn. You once blitzed out 90 moves of prep in a classical game and won on time. That's very nice. It's rare to win on time in classical, if you're playing with increment especially. But I guess you might have just got a very good position. So the point of queen g3 is that you're targeting the g7 pawn, so that if they castle, there's, in this specific line, bishop f6 takes, knight e4 would hit the bishop, and if bishop goes back to e7, there's knight to e5 going after this pin on the queen and the bishop, and white simply wins, given that there is this pin. If the queen wasn't on g3, and the queen was just like in the middle of nowhere, let's say it goes on e1, on castles, you could even consider gf6, king h8, and bringing the rook. So it's just an alternative where you don't have to take with the bishop, and the queen is simply not participating in the attack when the knight goes to e4. So that's why the queen goes to g3. Alternatively, black can go pawn to e5. And once again, I like queen d3. And guess what? We transpose. Bishop e7, bishop takes, knight d5, castles. You can take on f6, queen f6, and c4. And this is the same position that we had earlier. You can get this position a couple ways. But if they ever play e5, this bind setup against the light square bishop is excellent. Stops them from ever breaking with d5. Their only possible pawn break is b5, so just keep an eye on that. Potentially a4 and b3 can lock it down in the future. Additionally, if you can get your knight either to d5 or somehow to c3, then that can be a great square for the knight. So we're going to go all the way back. There aren't really any other attempts of setups other than e5 or knight f6 or e6. These are all the setup attempts from black against queen takes d4, because you can't ever go for g6 to develop the bishop, because the rook would simply hang in the corner. So I think we've covered d6 quite thoroughly. Let's look at pawn to b5, which is the next most common way to play. The setup that I like against pawn to b5 is actually pawn to d4. You strike in the center. You strike in the center. And the reason you want to do this is because, once again, after c takes, you get your queen to the middle. You spy this pawn here, preventing g6, which will be a very nice setup. If they go knight f6, you have e5 to kick the knight. This is terrible. The knight has no good squares. If the knight jumps to the side, g4 already traps the knight. So the knight would have to go back to g8. White is clearly better. We don't have to analyze this. Alternatively, they could play d6, but then you actually have this tricky move, pawn to a4. And there's no b4 because the queen is covering b4. And they don't want to take because actually the move's castles, but you're just going to collect this pawn, play bishop e3, stack the rooks on the a file, or put this rook on the d file, and white holds a very nice advantage with this weak a6 pawn. You can play this very comfortably. There's also moves like e5 after you bring your rook to the center, and say queen takes a4. The bishop would have to block. You know, the queen can move out of the way somewhere, knight goes to the center, and you can exploit this pin again. So there's a4, often very common motif against a6, b5. You want to try and chip away at this structure. If they just keep developing, you're taking, there's a pin there. So yeah, a4 pretty much refutes d6. e6, there looks like there's a4, but then there's b4 because now this bishop is covering the pawn and defending its advance deep into the white position. This is not very pleasant. The knight will go back to e2, bishop b7, and white is just a little bit worse. Not lots worse, it wouldn't be a disaster. You can bring this knight, defend the pawn, castle. Not the end of the world, but it's not great either. So after pawn to e6, instead, you want to play bishop to g5. And the reason here is that after knight here, e5 wins the knight, because after h6, ef takes, you can take on g7. And if they try something like e5, you can just take and make a queen. So they can't play knight f6. They can play knight e7, long castles now, and you've got lots of pressure. Whoops. You have lots of pressure down at the open center file. This is a nice position. You can play e5, knight e4, knight d6. That's even a mate threat technically. Pawn b4 also not a threat because of actually a funny move. Takes, and the attack is simply raging. You can keep this knight sacrifice in center in your mind. Pawn d6 is a huge threat. They have to go d6, bishop e7, bishop e7, queen g7, rook f8. Bring your rook. You know, the knight's coming to c6 or to f5. This bishop can never keep track of both of them. So the engine's giving the best move is king d7. No one's probably going to play that. People probably play this move. Then you could consider this knight f5 coming. Apparently king d7 now holds the game, but it's getting very tricky at least. So you can get a good position like this. If they go to f6, bishop f4 looks like it runs into e5. Hi, hater. Yeah, wow. There's some nice lines, yeah. It looks like it runs into e5, but there is the move queen d5 that hits the rook. Bishop f4 would make me a little bit uncomfortable, though. I like the bishop just sitting on e3. Long castles can come again. You remember this tactic. That's good. Yeah, the knight sacrifice on d5 is pretty common when black is super underdeveloped in these Sicilians, and you can already bring a rook to the middle. So definitely good to keep in mind. So alternatively, bishop to b7 I think is attempted quite a few times. I'm going to try and find this in my own opening tree. So b5, as I said, second most common move. Takes, queen takes. Yeah, bishop to b7 is the logical follow-up and the most common approach from black. I've always just castled here, which is actually slightly inaccurate. It's the third engine move, but a4 is stronger. It attacks this pawn here while there's no b4. And if you play e6, there's just ab5 takes, rook takes, bishop takes, knight takes, queen a5, knight drops back. Let's say bishop to b4 doesn't... Oh yeah, bishop b4 doesn't work because the g pawn's loose. So they have to play knight f6 first, castles, then develop the bishop. But you already have an extra pawn here and a good initiative on the king side. So this is not very good for black either. Alright, so we've covered... If there's no b4, then a4 is strong. Exactly. Yeah, that's correct. When the pawn is on b5, if you can play a4 and they can't push it, then this is very good. So really the best move here for black is e6. But you can either play your bishop out here or out here. Short castle or long castle. e5 will probably come. You can put your knight on e4 and then on d6, and you can try and play a good game. So I think that pretty much covers pawn to b5. I don't think it's the best attempt from black. So let's go back to the opening tree. Alternatives of pawn to b5. We've looked at d6, we've looked at b5 now. We can also look at e6. That's the next most common. Then we'll look at g6. Let's go back. Pawn to e6. d4 takes. b5 is most common. We transpose. Bishop f4, get a good game, or bishop g5. Alternatively, knight f6, e5, loses. d6, bishop g5. Knight f6, unpleasant. Knight f6, I guess there's long castles, and then e5. So this wouldn't be good. So e6 transposes into a lot of b5 lines, and you can just treat it like a position. You don't have to study it too much. Is c takes the only good move? Well, the issue is, if they don't take, it is the only good move. And the reason is because, let's say they don't take. You take on c5. You take the queen. You can put the knight in the center and attack this pawn already. Bishop g5, long castles. And if they play the e6 setup, you play d5. I don't even know what else they would play. Let's say they play b5, you play d5. And you get this pawn wedged into the position. Bishop to b7, castles. They could play b4. Then you have knight a4. What is CD? CD4 is the only good move for black. What do you mean by if they push? In what position are you talking about, Dev? You want them to play c4. c4, there's d5. This is unpleasant. You've traded off your light squared bishop, so you can put the light squared pawn wedge in the center. This is a bit like the Benoni, but even worse with this pawn weakness here. They can't push. They have to take. If they don't take, they're just worse. You either push, or if they play d5, I don't know if that's what you're suggesting. There's captures here. Takes. It's a free pawn. Yeah, I don't really see anything else. So the other system they could attempt is g6. This is bad. d4 captures, queen captures, hits the rook. Knight f6, e5, knight g8. knight d5. All these weak squares looks horrible. Horrible. Just play this. Long castles. e6 is terrible. Knight b6, knight c4, knight d6. There's not really much you can do. I mean, that apparently that just hangs with rook, so they'll probably play rook b8. Whoops. Rook to b8. But then there's just knight c4, knight d6. Queen d6 supposedly is stronger. Oh, because it traps the rook. That's really nasty. So I'll keep that one in mind. But realistically, no one's going to allow this. This g6 setup's just bad. If they play f6, you can just bishop e3. Knight d5 is better again. I guess this knight d5, knight b6, when they played a6, is pretty good. So yeah, g6 is not really a serious attempt. Even though I've actually not done that well against it. So what's the problem? Okay, no, I've won all the games that reach this position, so it doesn't really matter. I must have been messing up earlier, because I have played these all the way from like 1800, so I probably wasn't playing them best all the way. Really just interesting to see what the opponents are likely to play. Okay, so we've covered b5, d6, e6, and g6. Realistically, those are all of the attempts the black will try. They might play knight f6, but e5, once again, you're just much, much better. e5, d4, win the game. All right, so that is pretty much the knight takes on b5 line fully checked. Let's go back and look at the most common other lines for black. So knight takes on b5 is number one. a6 is a pretty big beast we're gonna have to cover. We've also not looked at g6 yet. We have covered knight takes and then d5, but so far we've only looked at knight b5. So there's a6 to look at. I guess d6 to look at, e6, and that should do. Oh wait, no, yeah, it's black. What? Oh, d6 isn't legal because the bishop's blocking that, of course. Okay. So let's look at a6. This is pretty much the main line. This is the best approach for black. The bishop goes to this weird square d3. I was going to ask if anyone knew what the best approach for white was with this bishop d3 move, because it looks pretty weird. And then here black often goes for g6, castles, bishop g7, and we go rook e1. And rook e1's a bit of a waiting move, because if they go knight to f6, we have e5. And let's say the knight goes to the side. You can go something like bishop f1. You guard the pawn with these pieces here. And after castles, d3. You can even consider playing g4 at some point if they don't stop it. So let's say they were to play something terrible. g6 traps then, g4 traps their knight. So they have to play d6. Takes, knight takes. C takes, bishop takes, d4 is not good on account of knight e2. You go knight e2 anyway. And you're probably going to break with c3 in the future. So something like here, c3, take, knight takes. You play your bishop out. You can maybe consider fianchettoing. And this is just equal. Unfortunately, this is the best approach for black. Not many people play it though, but this is just leads to equality. Let's say here, d4, try and play d5. They have to play d5. Bishop e3. It's a pretty symmetrical position. So, instead of all of that, what you might be more likely to get rather than knight f6 because people are afraid of e5. So I think d6 and e6 are quite common. I'll just take a look. Take a look at what the most common moves are. So we were analyzing a6, bishop d3, g6, castles, bishop g7, rook e1. d6 and e6 are the most common attempts. So let's look at d6. There's knight takes, c takes, knight e2. I had a classical game that went like this actually, got a really good position. e5, there's c3. You'll capture, give them doubled pawns, play b3, bishop b2. So knight e7, takes, takes, b3, castles, bishop b2, knight c6. Actually, there's a weird line now that I'm remembering with pawn to b4, where you go a4, b5. I don't quite remember in which situation this was though. But yeah, c3 is very standard here. If they capture this pawn, you can take with the d pawn, you play bishop to e3, c4, b3, f3, turn into a Maroczy bind. You make all these moves, clamp down on the center d5 square, and you can put your knight there. If they play e6, you can play e5, knight to e7, knight e4. You can go for these nice looking squares here on d6 and f6. Yes, bishop c4 is another approach. I don't like it. They play e6, knight c6. I just feel these are basically positions very similar to the Grand Prix, except you have the knight on f3 without the pawn on f4, so it's kind of just even worse. So I don't like bishop c4. But bishop c4 is playable. If you want to play it like, say, not d3, I mean a3, like knight f6, d3, b5, bishop a2. You can definitely play chess like this, for sure. Like bishop e7. Whoops. Like this line's fine as well. So alternatively, if you want to play like this, but you play like f4, f5, and you do play a Grand Prix setup, yes, I think this can be played with a lot of success with white. Bishop c4 is a great alternative. So I would consider it. If they go for a6, you can definitely play bishop c4. It's just that I've always played bishop d3. But bishop c4 and a5 or a3 is a really valid setup. You'll trade the knight and play f4. In fact, I think this is probably even easier to play and more logical than bishop to d3. So I think, yeah. I think I probably should recommend bishop c4, yeah. The only issue is that after b5, bishop d5 here, there's a high risk of getting your bishop trapped. So I guess you play not a4, you play a3. They could even consider a weird move like c4, but no, that hangs a knight. But maybe like knight takes, but then queen takes. I don't know. It just, I've never quite liked this. Apparently, the only move to keep white in the game here is queen g3, although it's actually quite a nice move. Bishop c6. Weird stuff. I've not analyzed these lines properly before, but they do look valid if you want to learn them. Just not what I was mostly covering. But I think we've looked at bishop d3 enough in this a6 line. Let's look at g6. Let's look at g6. I believe that's the next most common. As you can see, g6 played here 29 times. So let's look at g6. g6, I think I'm playing castles, yeah. I'm castling. Castles, I think, is the most logical. I think it's the move in the master's database. It's third move. Bishop c4 is also common. Thanks for analyzing your 9, no problem. So yeah, castles. I like castles because it gives them the attempt to take the bishop again, which is bad. Because takes, bishop g7, there's d4. And after a6, knight c3, there's this line with pawn to d5. You can play dc, bishop takes, b takes, queen takes, and knight to e5. Once again, you guys might remember this from earlier on in the stream. These tripled c pawns are not bad. I had an argument with someone about these tripled c pawns, actually. They were saying they were positionally bad, but I think they're actually quite good. Let's say king goes back, rook b1. Once again, you play bishop to e3, knight c4, knight b6, or knight d6. If they play this, e6, the knight can go to c4. And the knight is simply dancing, loving life. Bishop goes on e3, like I said. Rooks to the b and d file, and you get a good game. Very comfortable. Pawn up. So, this move, bishop g7, not very good after they trade the bishop. What's most likely, if we just go check the opening tree, is actually bishop g7, yeah. It's the natural follow-up. That's why people play g6. Even though a6 is technically the best move, I think you can play bishop to c4 quite confidently on f6. And on b5, bishop d5, rook to b8. I like a3 here. Here, d3, say e6, bishop a2. Trade the knights, knight e2, f4, f5. Play this line. This looks good. Let's run it back. But if people are not playing a6 way back here instead of g6, they're probably not going to play a6 anyway. They're going to go for bishop g7. And on the move bishop to g7, I think, let's check what I was playing. I'm playing rook e1, mostly. And also knight takes d4 with some success. So let's see, knight takes d4 is the best main move, so I'm assuming that I updated my repertoire. Sometime I checked this and switched from playing rook e1 to knight d4. So knight takes d4, c takes, knight to e2. a6, bishop a4, b5, bishop b3, bishop b7, d3. And once again, you have this position, they can play e6, you have f4. And you can play f5. Very aggressive setup. You can take. This might not be the absolute most sharp way to play if they play e6. Maybe a4 is very strong. Open up the a file. This is actually quite a common motif like we talked about earlier, remember? If pawn to b4 doesn't come with a hit on the knight, then pawn can go to a4 is very strong. And in this particular position, it actually points out something extremely useful. You want to play bishop to d2 to win the pawn, but then they play a5. So instead of playing bishop to d2, you play pawn to a5, and then bishop d2, queen e1, and you will collect this b pawn. So like knight c6, bishop d2, knight c6, queen e1. The b pawn is dropping. They can't stop you. There's no queen b6. Queen e7's flimsy. f4, f5. Maybe even f6. This looks good. Once again, people who are in the chat, if you have any questions or lines you want me to look at, I will analyze them, as I think it's definitely important. Hello on the Twitch chat. allow Lua 54. What is up? We are currently analyzing the closed Sicilian bishop e5 line with the white pieces, trying to get people a nice concrete setup to play. So I don't think bishop g7 is very good, even though it's very common here. They could play knight f6. You have e5. Hello. Mukund. You have e5, knight takes in the center, bishop takes, knight drops to f3, bishop g7, d4. You can play c4, bishop can drop back. Take the full center. At this point, you're just playing chess, though. Not much more you can prep for. Are we only going to look at knight to d4? Yes. We're only looking at knight takes on d4 here. I think that's the best way to approach it. I was playing rook e1 previously, but now this system is actually annoying. So I'll show you a6 here, d6, and this is slightly different because we don't get to take here and damage their c-pawn. So yeah, it's just, I think it's rook e1's a little bit inferior. It's not a huge problem if you don't play knight takes d4 though. Okay, I don't really know what that comment was on Twitch. That's a bit weird. I think they're trying to sell me cryptocurrencies. You mean knight d4 after bishop e5? Oh, yeah. No, we're not only looking at knight d4. I will actually cover... But the reason why we're looking at knight d4 at the moment is because every other move other than knight d4 is bad. And I'm going to show you why. Actually, I think have we finished looking at g6, I think? Yeah, there's no more to look at g6. So let's talk about why all of the other moves other than knight d4 are bad. That's a good thing to cover. I might edit this around and put this near the start. But I have actually discussed this right at the very start if you were to look back at that. But I'll go through it again in a bit more detail. And the reason why all the other moves are bad. So let's talk about a6, d6, e6, g6. All of these four moves. Knight f6 is possible, but it's just bad because you play e5. So let's not talk about knight f6. All of these developing moves from the black pieces are bad for the same reason. d6 is bad because of bishop c6. You play f4 first, actually. You play f4, knight f6, knight f3. You get this setup, castles. And let's say you go b3 and d5, e5, knight d7, knight a4. Actually, knight a4 is a bit inaccurate. You probably want queen e2 to stop this c-pawn moving. You normally play the King's Indian attack setups against the Sicilian, but this is interesting. Yeah, I think this is a good alternative sideline. I definitely think King's Indian attack setups against Sicilian's pretty good as well. So the reason I like this, knight b6 takes, queen takes, actually not a4, sorry. You play like, no, okay, wait. I'm trying to get the perfect setup. Unfortunately, it's not quite working. It's like an accelerated Rossolimo. Well, it's like playing the Rossolimo in the closed Sicilian. Kind of, yeah. But the whole point is, you want a position where you fight against this bishop that's walled out. So I probably messed up getting the perfect version of it. I guess bishop a3... apparently the best move is now c4. Black can play f6. Yes, black can play f6. But f6 is always a huge concession. Here, the knight can jump in. and you still get this walled out position where you play like b3 and d3. If you can ever play c4 eventually, it's very, very good, but you're just fighting against these doubled c pawns. You bring your rook to the center. I mean, black is just suffering here. The c pawn cannot move. It would be lost for 1. You would trade bishops for 2. And eventually you're going to play moves like queen f2, knight a4. You're going to gang up on this c pawn. Maybe you don't do it immediately. You stay patient. But your plan will always be restrict this c pawn push, and then you fight for this doubled c pawn. And so that's what you do against d6. What do you do against a6? Once again, you'd capture. You play d3. They play d5, you go f4. Right? If they go knight f6, you have e5. Bishop d6, you can just develop knight f3. They can't go knight f6 because e5. Once again, e5, castles, castles. Same plan. You can play knight a4 here. b3, bishop a3, queen e1, queen f2. Yet again, you're going to play moves like c4. You're going to win this c5 pawn. So another very simple way to play. So that's e6. What if they play g6? Once again, you're taking. f4 plans are the best when they allow you to capture this knight. That's how you get the perfect structure. Because as I've already said near the very start, my name is Magnus, yes, Ruler. Near the very start, I was saying I love the Grand Prix attack. The Grand Prix attack's fantastic when you can get this exchange of the bishop for the knight. What I don't like is when they get to play this knight to d4 move. However, if you've not played f4, allowing knight to d4 is a lot less of a problem. So this is why I like bishop to b4 immediately. Okay. So yeah, once again, takes. Why are you... What's wrong, Rudera? Is there something you're confused about in the game? I mean, the analysis? My name is Magnus, yes. Bishop g7, f4, d5, knight f3, e6, castles, knight f6, e5 here. 23. Well, I'm not 2300 over the board, but. And yet again, b3, bishop a3, knight a4, queen e1, queen f2. Same plan, same deal. It's all identical. If they ever play f6, you capture it, put something in the middle. These positions are so much better for white. You're going to win the c pawn. I've actually got a couple sample games for you guys if you want to take a look. So I've probably got some games. Probably got a game that goes like g6. I'll just take a look. Always taking here. Oh yeah, so if they take this way, it's still no good. You play the same stuff. But except the only difference is you might go a4, a5, a6. So let's get this here. You are 2000. Is that over the board? I think I've played you a couple games, Ruder, have I? d6, castles. Castles. Queen e1. Lots of different moves here. I like queen e1, b3, bishop a3, knight a4. And let's just go down the most common moves. Here, what am I playing? Queen h4 is not that good. I don't know why I was doing that. b3 is what I should have been playing. And let's see. Let's take an example game. Do I always play d3? Against this specific setup, yes. So against what I'm taking on c6, I do. So I think this looks like a good example game of how you can get a smooth win with this opening if they do anything but knight d4. Knight d4 is the only move that doesn't leave black considerably worse. So this was obviously back when I was playing the Grand Prix. d3, castles, castles, queen e1. And I was playing b3, even though e5 is objectively a little bit better, not a huge deal. Now we play e5, bishop a3, knight a4, takes, takes. I brought a rook to the center, put a bishop on d6. And I just played versus these weak pawns, this bad knight, bad bishop, bad bishop. Like, black's pieces are completely discombobulated. I doubled up, took back with the knight. I simply exchanged pieces. Dominant knight versus a bad bishop. The bishop was trapped. If here, I can, whoops. I would probably just take back with the knight even, but then this bishop takes c4. So probably ba is good if they take here. There's knight e4, knight f6, goes for mate. Brutal. There's even knight e4 anyway, actually. Here, knight e4 as well. Looks strong. So, yeah, basically my opponent just got crushed this game. I went a piece up. Easy conversion, they resigned. So I think that's a pretty fairly good example of how you can try and dominate the position with this line. So yeah, none of these other systems other than knight d4 are any good. They're all bad. If your opponent plays anything but knight to d4, you will capture the knight. You'll play d3, f4, knight f3, castles, probably e5 at some point, queen e1, b3, bishop a3, knight a4, win that c pawn. If you need to, get your queen to f2, take on f6 when they give you the chance, all of that stuff. All that stuff. All right. So back to knight to d4. The best move, the best response from black. Let's go back to the opening tree. Looking at the most common moves. Actually, queen c7 is an interesting one. But queen c7 is knight d4. Knight d5 even. Attack the queen. Doesn't look very good. Also on queen c7 you could take and play like d4. This doesn't look too bad either. So we've covered a6. We've covered knight takes b5. Now we have to cover e6, knight f6, and g6. You're watching this, being a d4 player. It's never too late, Dev. It's never too late to become an e4 player. Admittedly, I have actually been testing out d4 myself recently, and actually having some fun with that as well. Wouldn't be too confident to try and do an openings lesson on it, though. I'm still learning. So, yeah. We've looked at knight takes bishop. We've looked at a6, e6, knight f6, and g6. So e6. Castles. Once again, if knight takes bishop, we're transposing into the lines that I talked about earlier. And if they play a6, then bishop to d3, and we'll transpose into the bishop d3 lines that I talked about earlier. I don't like bishop c4 is not possible in this line because then they go b4, bishop goes back, that you get trapped. Oh, wait, sorry, no, they take on f3 first, and then you get trapped. And alternatively, you play bishop d3, but now you've just like let black take loads of space for no reason. So if they were to play a6, bishop d3, and that's why we have to at least learn some bishop d3 lines so that we can play against it in this setup. But bishop c4 is also very good in the other setup. Alternatively, They could play a move. If they play knight f6, there's e5. If they play bishop to e7, knight d4 takes knight e2, knight f6, d3, a6. I guess bishop c4, b5, bishop b3. You're going to play a4. You can play knight takes in the center. If queen goes to b6, c3 takes. Okay. Getting suggested this move. I guess a4 is helped out. Taking with the b pawn looks very natural as well. Bishop e3, play in the center. This looks good enough. So that's not a big threat. Hi, Nimish. So, e6 has a lot of transpositions. Not a whole lot we need to cover for this one. Nothing too special. You castle, knight f6, e5, bishop e7, we take the knight. They take our bishop, we take back, transposes. a6, bishop d3, transposes. So e6, no new theory. Knight f6, e5, don't have to cover that. It's just bad. It's just no good. Best suggestion is currently this from the engine. Something like this. Don't even know. Knight c7. I was thinking here, and d4 looks good. Takes knight, queen takes even. This position looks great. I play this with white. And so yeah, e5 doesn't have to be covered. And now it's just g6. Now it's just g6. Working out the team's squad. Yeah, sounds good, sounds good. Now it's just g6. G6. Castles. Oh wait, no, we've looked at g6. Wait a minute. Have I covered all of it? Someone remember? We've looked at knight b5. We've looked at a6. We've now looked at e6. Also knight f6 and g6. Those are all the main moves, guys. We got through it. This is apparently another move, but this is just no good. d3 castles. Don't have to learn anything for this. So yeah. What else is white trying here? We've done g6, e6, d6, and a6 in this one as well. Knight f6 you can treat the same way. Just take this pawn, play d3, and then f4. You'll transpose. What else? e5 is just bad. Takes, d3, f4 again. You're going to take this pawn this time, though. That's the only difference. And yeah, I think that about covers it. Queen c7, takes, knight f3, d4 as well. I think that's everything. Does anyone have any questions standing out? Something that I might have missed, maybe? I'll give you guys a bit of time. Also, if anyone wants a quick game, I might be open to that as well. Potentially themed in this opening. Okay. So yeah, I think that about does me. Hopefully this opening lesson was useful. I think we covered some good ground. This should be all you really need to play confidently against the Sicilian. There was one line I'm trying to remember. What is it? No, I think that line's actually just in the regular Grand Prix. So yeah, that's everything. That's everything in Bishop b5. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I think I'm going to end stream here if no one wants a game. Okay. Thank you guys for watching, and yeah, I'll see you in the next videos. Bye. I edit this one down, so it'll be more consumable to rewatch, and timestamps, of course, will be available.